Good morning. I am so exhilarated, thrilled, and excited to see you all on this special occasion. And on this occasion, to be able to say, as president of the Ford Foundation, I stand on the shoulders of an extraordinary, exceptional man whose story is documented in this beautiful, melodious memoir, An Unplanned Life. Franklin Thomas was an icon, but he was also a very special human being who touched us in unusual ways as those people who are rare are able to do. He changed this institution, most certainly indeed. He saved this institution. But he transformed societies from the United States to South Africa. Domains and disciplines were created by Franklin Thomas. He was the consummate gentleman. He had both ambition and humility. He was righteous without being self-righteous. He inspired us. I feel so grateful to have known him and learned from him. To wallow in his wisdom was a privilege. And today's program will give, for those of you who know Frank, familiar reflections, but also some new things that maybe we didn't know. I can't talk about Franklin A. Thomas without talking about the woman who was his treasure. Her name is Kate Whitney. And Kate, please stand. Would you please help Kate to stand so that she can be recognized? Kate, this day would not be possible without you, because as you know, this book would not be possible without you, without your relentless determination to see him turn that manuscript in, and for the countless time you spent editing and adding things that we needed to know, and for the hours you and the children spent in amassing these photographs and curating this extraordinary trove of visual representation of Frank's life and the people and the experiences that made his life so special. It is all here in this book. And for those of us who knew Frank, we know that you were his anchor. His love for you, Kate, was palpable. He glowed in your presence. And when he spoke of you, he did with such reverence and passion and love. I know you miss him. We all miss him. But your loss is a unique and individual one. And we are all here with you today to express our love, admiration, and adoration to you for all the things you did to make his life a happy, joyful one. And so we have three interventions this morning that I'm looking forward to. The first is a conversation with two of Franklin Thomas's remarkable children, Keith Thomas and Hillary Thomas Lake, who we all know and love. And they will be in conversation with Cecilia Cancelaro. Cecilia, you too deserve a lot of credit, because as you remember, several years ago, she received a phone call from the Ford Foundation saying, would you go and meet with Franklin Thomas to just talk to him and maybe cajole and push him a little bit to get this memoir project done, just to begin drafting the manuscript. And I remember sitting with him in his office after his first meeting with you, and he said, I think I found the person who's going to help me get this done. And you did. So the combination of these two formidable women in you and Kate. Of course, Frank always loved working with formidable women. And once again, two formidable women delivered. So we will hear first from the children and from Cecilia, and then there will be a panel discussion, a conversation between two great friends of Frank, his dear friend, Judge Pierre Laval, and Kenneth Chenault, the former chairman of American Express. They will be moderated by the award-winning journalist, Charles Blow. And we will end our formal presentation with reflections from another formidable woman who played a critical role in Frank's life, Susan Beresford, who I would say with Frank were on a journey from the moment McGeorge Bundy passed the baton to Frank, and years later when Frank passed the baton to Susan to lead this institution and beyond, their partnership was critical in each of their lives. So we're looking forward, Susan, to your reflections later this morning. So with that, I am going to turn the program over to you, Cecilia, and and the children, then that would be Hillary and Keith. Where are Hillary and Keith? Hillary is here, but I was looking for Keith, and Keith is here. Oh, of course. I was a little thrown off because I was looking for Keith and thinking, oh my goodness, what happened to Keith? And Keith just appears.
Just appeared.
I love it. Over to you.
On cue, no less.
Do you want to get started? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Oh, great.
Perfect.
Good morning.
Good morning to all. What a wonderful crowd. Well, thank you, Darren, for that wonderful introduction. This is a wonderful time for us to be together. Good morning to all, and this is a great way for us to remember my dad and his legacy here at the Foundation and in society. Cecilia? I'm sorry?
I'd like to say a vote of thanks on behalf of the family, if I may, before we dive in.
Sure.
So, on behalf of the family, it's natural that we would be here, or it seems natural that we'd be here at the Ford Foundation, celebrating the launch of my dad's book after his death. And yet, it's not a given. None of us in the family feels entitled to Ford or entitled to special favors and considerations from Ford. We love you, Darren, for the way you continue to love us and the way your team worked so diligently to help put this day together, because it's a function of the courtesy, the love, and the respect that you feel for us based on how close you were to our dad. So we really appreciate you putting this together. And I know I speak on behalf of our mother and siblings, all the family here, when I say thank you. Thank you very much. And now you can go.
Okay, well, let's get started. Cecilia, you worked very hard together with Dad to produce this wonderful book. How did you guys get together?
So it was 2017. We started working in the spring of 2017. And as Darren just talked about, there were many people trying to get Frank to put his life into words. I had no idea how many people were trying to get him to do that. And I think it was my former colleague and friend Dawn Davis, who at the time was running the 37 Ink imprint at Simon & Schuster, who recommended me to Darren. And I got a call. Would I go meet with Frank? I heard what the project was. I was, of course, like very excited about the prospect of it. And so I went in, and we had just an incredible meeting. We connected we just connected right away. And it's hard to say what informs that kind of ease when you have it with someone, but we had it. And that was super important for this kind of book because, Frank was basically entrusting me to help him put his life, his extraordinary, impactful life, into words. And so he had to trust me. I had to feel like I had a good understanding of who he was and what his vision was and his worldview, et cetera. And we had that. Why? I mean, we're very different people, right, from very different circumstances, but we connected about, one of the things we connected about right away, during that conversation, Frank started to tell me a lot about his childhood and about his family and his mother. And, when you hear about Frank's mother, you hear about the value of work and education, and also your responsibility in making good use of those things. And that was very familiar to me. Maybe as another first-generation college student, I heard those same things growing up in my family. So I think that sort of was maybe one of our points of connection. But it was a great connection. It was, when I got the call to say, yes, you're the one who's going to do it, I was delighted that I would be getting to spend time with Frank and getting this story on paper. And I had no idea just how challenging it would be in some ways.
To draw out
Yes.
similar experiences.
Yes.
What was the process that you went through? And Dad is very process-oriented. What was the process that you guys went through in order to draw this information out from him and to get it in written form?
Yeah, so I guess I'm pretty process-oriented too. So I immediately wrote up a plan, like this is, how about if we do this and we'll do it this way? And he was like, great, that sounds great. So what I would do is once a month, I'd go to his office and we'd sit together for hours, 2 or 3 hours, and we'd talk. We'd talk about his entire life from, his childhood to his time at Columbia, both as an undergrad and law school, his time in the Air Force, his time at the U.S. Attorney's Office, obviously Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, the Ford Foundation, South Africa. We talked about everything. And during those meetings, I would get him to just tell me about those things, the stories about his life and things that happened. But here's the thing, and this is the one question that is the overarching question of this whole project is, how do you help someone write their autobiography when they don't like talking about themselves and their own accomplishments? So Frank we would have wonderful conversations, but then I had to be on the ground myself. So I visited many archives. I visited the Rockefeller Archive where the Ford Foundation papers are. I spent a few days at the Restoration Corporation. I wouldn't call it an archive, but I poured through closets filled with old binders with meeting minutes in them. I found various interviews and oral histories that Frank had done over many years that were in very sporadic places. So I tracked those down, listened to those. I did a lot of searching with newspapers and press releases, and I found a lot of correspondence. I mean, all these things that would enable me to go into the meetings armed with information and say, what about this? Can we talk about this? And how about that? And the really wonderful thing about this was that, Frank had, many of these things were things he hadn't thought about in a long time. Some of them he'd forgotten. So when I would bring this in, he would say to me, this is wonderful, like, I thank you. Like, so it was so rewarding for me to be able to kind of relive some of these memories with him. The other thing that happened during that time that was crucial was Juliana Richardson convinced Frank that same year to do the History Makers oral history project. And so that involved hours of him being interviewed and hours of his friends and family and colleagues being interviewed. And she generously gave me access to those interviews. So I had all of those transcripts. So I would sneakily find all these things that other people were saying about Frank and try to find a way to weave those quotes and those comments into his own narrative. So it was very sneaky, but these great things needed to be said, and he wouldn't say them, but I had to get them in there, so that's how I did it, and he was okay with that. He was actually fine with that.
So now we understand the process that you went through. What was it actually like during your back and forth, trying to get to the bottom of everything that was important?
Yeah, I mean, it was, so I think there are a lot of people in this room who've worked with Frank, so you'll know that when Frank decides you're the person for the job, he lets you do your job. You know, he has had an incredible sense of judgment and instincts that guided him, and so, and it was interesting because after I started working with him and I was doing all this research for the book and hearing about, I would see that, you know, when he hired people throughout his life, and sometimes they were not always the traditional people for those roles, but if he thought you could do it, he gave you the job and he supported you and he brought out the best in you, but he let you do your work. And that's what it was like. I mean, he was wonderful. We talked, I would write things, he would write things, we would put them all together, I'd send him chapters to read. It was just a lovely process in all the best ways that a collaboration can happen. So it was really, I mean, I've been in and around the world of books for 35 years now, and this was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my entire career.
Wow, thank you very much. That's very nice of you to say. Hillary.
Yes, older brother. Ask away.
How do you think Dad would characterize the racial tension in today's society and the tribalism that we're hearing on the eve of the midterm elections?
Okay, so.
Just kind of
As they say,
current day, right?
as they say in Washington, D.C., where I live, it's on now. So where to start? Obviously, I have a quote from the book, but I think, so I'll start with the quote, and then maybe I'll say what I would like to say. So Dad believed, and this is a quote from the book, he said that the dream of America is a more generous, more expansive, and a more noble dream than simply the dream of individual success and security. And we have to remind people of that greater dream. So I think it starts there, right? So that's from the general, the universal that embraces us all and concerns us all in one way or another. Let's boil it down now to the specific. I think our beloved Dad, who very late in life learned how to curse, would probably see what's going on the eve of these elections, for which I'm running back to DC to vote tomorrow, and say, wow, this is some bullshit. And not because he wouldn't know what to do about it, but simply because it's tiresome, right? This is the same story, different decade, different century. But I think that he was, above all things, an optimist. And I think he would have said to us, look, each one of us has to do our very best. And part of doing our very best means participating. We can be upset about the way things are going. We can be disappointed. We can even feel downtrodden. I mean, our rights as people, as a collective and as individuals, are being trampled on every single day. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is a pretty sympathetic crowd. It looks like the choir to me, so I'm going to preach a little bit. But so our rights are being trampled on every day, and yet we can't give up. We cannot, we must not give up. If everybody in this room commits to participating and commits to being open-minded about how we make change happen, and I think that's one of the big things. As you know, I would spend a lot of time with Uncle Vernon Jordan, who's now no longer with us, and Dad, and they were icons of their generation and of their day, and yet what really matters, why does this book even matter? It's because we need to take the most iconic aspects of their lives, of their ethics, and translate those things into something meaningful and useful today and for the generations to come. Because otherwise, their lives will not have served a purpose beyond what they achieved and then what died with them. What lives on is, I think, an important invitation to all of us to take a quantum leap, to really look at each other and see each other, and to be open to the importance of not resting on our own laurels. It's not because we understand about civil rights, hi Ken, welcome, because we understand about the importance of rights for women, for children, for people who identify beyond, above, or around this gender binary that they want to stick us with all the time. We understand about those things, and we're supportive, we're allies, but we have to go beyond that. We have to also be open, I think, in this new era, with all of these racial tensions and all of these social tensions. Be open to younger people showing us the way, and be open to collaborating, being led by them, and bringing our useful energies. I think his life, and certainly this book, are an invitation to all of us to challenge ourselves beyond what we believe we know how to do well, beyond what we believe are our good ethics, good morals, to be open to being challenged, to understand that someone could say that you've made a racist comment. That doesn't mean you're a racist, but let's check ourselves, right? Let's check how we behave and how we think, and let's not make assumptions. My dad was the first feminist I ever knew. And I'll never forget, I was maybe 11, and we were at a restaurant here in New York, it was a family gathering, and a wedding party came into the restaurant. So this incredibly beautiful woman in a gorgeous wedding gown, with a little cashmere sweater kind of thrown over her shoulders, and she walks through the door, and I'm transfixed, watching this woman, thinking, wow. And then I look at my dad and say, her husband didn't open the door for her. And mind you, I'm 11, right? I have no husband, no boyfriend, no nothing, right? So my father looks at me and he says, well, I think you need to understand something, sweetheart. And when the sweetheart would come at the end of the sentence, you knew that I was about to get schooled. And he said, there are no assigned roles. That's not how this works. They're here to celebrate a joyous occasion, and she can open the door for him or for herself, and it's fine. Don't assume anything. And I considered myself at 11 to be quite conscious, right? But it was a great reminder, and once again, not a rap on the knuckles, but an invitation to look at things differently, to be open to the fact that I too can be challenged, no matter how generous I think I am, no matter how open-minded I think I am. So again, I think that he would invite us all on the eve of these very contentious elections not to take anything for granted, and to be focused on how we take a quantum leap from this hellhole in which we currently find ourselves to the great beyond. Better days, absolutely. Better days.
Better days.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to ask you this last question, given how much ground you've covered with this, but I'll give it a shot.
I'm with quotes, so we can ask away.
I'll give it a shot. You traveled with Dad and with Kate on what was Dad's last trip to South Africa. And I wondered if you would take us through some of the conclusions that you think he had about race in Brazil, South Africa, and the United States.
Sure. So I had the privilege of traveling with my parents to South Africa in December 2017. So at that time, Dad was 83, and I think the summer before we'd been together, and Kate had mentioned that the invitations kept coming from the University of the Witwatersrand, who wanted to give Dad an honorary doctorate. And he said, yeah, I'll get to it. And finally, that summer, he said, I think I probably should get to this soon before I'm no longer able to take a 16-hour plane ride from New York to Johannesburg. And I, who, along with my family, had lived in South Africa, and I'm an Africanist and a bunch of other things, jumped up and said, listen, if you guys are going, I'm going with you. Please, please, please. I want to go. So Kate said, well, that would be wonderful. I said, oh, anything you need, I would love to go. So about 2 weeks later, Kate calls and says, well, did you mean what you said when we were together about going? And I said, well, yes. She said, all right, well, we're leaving on this date and this date. The event is on this date. So off we went. It was an amazing trip. It was the trip of a lifetime for me. But I think for Dad also, I think before then he hadn't been in South Africa for about 5 or 6 years. And it was just such an eye-opening trip for him. I mean, first of all, he and Kate together, covering old ground that they'd covered together. But we stayed in a hotel where there was a restaurant that we ended up going to, I think almost every night, this wonderful fish spot. And the first day we got there, I mean, they were wide awake. I had jet lag. We finally got downstairs to dinner. And the server said, when he saw our parents, he said, oh, I'm so happy to see you here. I saw you earlier today when you were walking through the hotel. It was connected to a mall and they needed to do some shopping. And you were holding hands. And I thought to myself, when I grow old, I want somebody who can walk with me and hold my hand the way the two of you are holding hands. And Kate said, Frank, I think we're never leaving. And we laughed. So, but I think, so that was some of the personal side of it. But on the broader policy side and just looking at South Africa as a society, Dad gets honored and gets an honorary doctorate at the University of Witwatersrand in a ceremony, a full-on South African graduation ceremony. And if you haven't been to one, I highly recommend it. In which there is an Indian South African chancellor of the university, an incredible Xhosa language choir directed by an Afrikaner white woman, and all of these beautiful young people shining and hopeful of all across the spectrum of South Africa, receiving their undergraduate and graduate degrees. So I think for him, it was definitely a moment when he said, as he said to us afterwards, wow, they've come far. They've come far, and I'm happy to have been a part of that. That was really special. I think we understand the South Africa question is not over. And in fact, there's been some backsliding in what we consider to be some of the gains post-apartheid, particularly with Nelson Mandela's ascendancy to the presidency. But South Africa, Brazil, and the United States, as Darren would know, the Ford Foundation did a lovely compendium of an examination of race and progress on race in those 3 countries, 20 years ago now, maybe 25? I still have the big book, Barry, that's right, Barry, sorry. But they're very similar countries. There's a lot that South Africa does a lot better than we do here in terms of equity and at least having the conversation about racism and what that means in a post-apartheid context. Brazil, as former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, who was once a trustee of this venerable institution, once said, and forgive me if my Nigerian accent isn't as good as anybody else's here in the room, but he said, you know, if they ever get it together over there, it's the biggest black country in the Western Hemisphere. But he's right? He's talking about identity and race identity and identity politics. Brazil struggles. You know, Lula has just been reelected. I think Dad would be very glad to see that. Less because of any partisan participation in the kind of Bolsonaro-Lula fight, but more because of the things that he held dear, which was equity, which was openness, which was inclusion. I traveled to Brazil a long time ago when he was still president. I had just come from spending a year working in Senegal, and I went on this little tour, and I was staying with Joan Dassin, who at the time was the Ford Foundation representative in Brazil. And she might as well have been Brazilian. I mean, she'd gone to college there and just knew Brazil inside out, and was lovely, received me just as if I were her own child. And then along came these two African-American consultants who were doing a survey for the Ford Foundation about the question of equity in education in Brazil, which was a big deal. So this was 1989. And we met, and I loved them. And they said, well, we're going up to the Northeast and here and there. I said, oh, can I come? So I went along with them and got a real education about some of those inequities. But then I remember calling Dad and saying, you know, Dad, I never really thought about Brazil in the same way, as struggling the same way we struggle in the United States with some of the questions of race. And it was really interesting to go to the Ford Foundation office in Brazil, because I said, it's not as representative of what you say you believe in as one might have imagined it would have been. And he said, yes, you know, but we're still working on that, sweetheart. We're working on making sure that, he said, I'm an African-American man who lives in a country that has its own particularities around inclusion, around race relations. He said, and Brazil is different from the United States, but what I want is to be sure that in every Ford Foundation office across the world, there is a team of people who are looking at questions of equity, inclusion, and justice through the lens that's most appropriate to that country's context. And that lens always shifts, but I want people working there in those offices who are open to continuing to keep their eyes on that moving needle. And so I think, you know, today he would be happy about Lula's election in Brazil, but he would also be excited about South Africa and the United States, because all of this mess that we're in, all this push and pull, is about opportunity. It's an invitation for us to give the best of ourselves to being part of the solution, because now that we recognize what some of the problems are.
Well, I think that was our call.
All right.
I want to thank you, Hillary, and you, Cecilia, for all that you've done, and I hope everybody is enticed to read the book.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Thank you for leading us.
Go this way? This way?
Thank you. So we now are going to hear from a different dimension, and that is stories and reflections by two people who knew him from different phases, eras in his life. Judge Pierre Laval, who worked very closely with Frank, Ken Chenault, a corporate CEO and board member of many public companies, along with Frank, in conversation with Charles Blow. Please join me in welcoming them.
So you probably guys have so many stories about Franklin. I'm just going to try to stay out of the way. So Judge, I want to start with you. When did you first meet Franklin and begin to work with him?
Well, I'm going to say something before I get to that.
Okay.
It seemed to me as I prepared for this that people who have known Frank Thomas fall into three categories. Those who have met him immediately were impressed. They were impressed, for starters, by his incredible, handsome, good looks, his powerful frame, his seriousness, his calm, his calm. He was an extraordinary person to encounter. The second category are those who got to know him a little better. And people who got to know him a little better were dazzled with admiration. They were dazzled with admiration for his intelligence, his wisdom, his incredible capacity to solve problems, his attentiveness, his concentration, all those good values. The third category are those who got to know him really well, and they, without exception, not only admired him, they loved him. They loved him for what? They loved him for his understated but very, very palpable warmth, his honorableness, his decency, the wonderful twinkle of a smile that was always present. He would kind of press his lips together to suppress the smile that would raise the corners of his eyes, and you'd see this sweet humor always present in him. His immutable values, as Darren put it, he was righteous without ever being self-righteous, and his decency. So those were the only three ways of knowing Frank Thomas. My meeting with Frank Thomas in 1964 was the opening of the curtain of a golden era for my life. It was the start of my first real-world job in law. I had finished law school, I'd had a year of clerkship, and to my great excitement, I'd been hired by the great prosecutor, Bob Morgenthau, to be an assistant U.S. attorney, an AUSA. Every assistant in the office had a private office, except the two most junior, who by virtue of being the two most junior shared a big room. And I was, of course, put in the junior big room. And actually for a little while, for a couple of weeks or so, I had the big room to myself, waiting for the next most junior person to join the office. And you can imagine my mixture of eagerness and anxiety when I was told that tomorrow morning someone is joining you in the office. And the door opened, and in walked this 6'4" gorgeous black man of a powerful build, with that smile playing at the corners of his mouth and a warm, mellow, agreeable voice. I was dazzled. And he had incredible credentials as well. He had been captain of the Columbia basketball team. He had been an officer in the Air Force, where as a navigator, he used the classic old methods of shooting the stars to guide these super stratospheric surveillance planes in their circumnavigation of the globe. It was something terrific. Well, not 2 weeks after Frank joined the office, the most sensational case of its time broke. A plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty. This was something extraordinary. It was a civil rights case. It was a protest case. The defendants were three very decent black men, young men, who were protesting, and they had a lot to protest about. Remember, 1964, this was 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, and the shadow of Jim Crow and everything that went with us still hung pretty heavy over the United States, not just the South. The fourth defendant was a kind of a blonde bombshell of a woman from Canadian TV. I'll tell you more about her a little later. So whatever the justice of the cause that they had, a plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty had to be prosecuted. And our boss, Bob Morgenthau, appointed the finest lawyer in the office, Steve Kaufman, who's sitting right there, to take the case. And you can imagine our excitement and good fortune when we learned that Steve Kaufman had selected Frank and me to be his assistants in preparing and prosecuting that case. It was really something extraordinary. So for the next 8 months, Frank and I we lived in each other. We shared an office. We didn't just share an office. We shared each other's lives. We lived in each other's pockets. We lived in each other's heads. We worked 12 hours a day minimum, 7 days a week for 8 months or so in preparing that case. And it was just an extraordinary time, a golden age. Steve sent us to Montreal to investigate. We perceived that Michelle Duclos, the Canadian woman, might be the weak link in the plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty. Weak in the sense that the cause was perhaps less hers than theirs. So Steve sent us to Montreal to do whatever we could to follow every lead to try to get evidence against Michelle Duclos that would make such a solid case that she would have to become a state's witness, and to visit every member of her family and try to persuade them. And we had 4 extraordinary days in Montreal of pursuing all of those leads. And through Frank's imagination and extraordinary diligence, we found some incredible evidence. Don't think I have time to tell you that story, perhaps another time. But it was simply an amazing time. Now,
Just one piece of evidence. I'm so invested in the story at this point. I kind of have to know like something that you found.
all right. Well, what I haven't told you is that there was a police informant who had infiltrated this plot. And so everything that happened in the plot, all the advances in the plotting, became immediately known to the New York City Police Department, the FBI, and once Michelle Duclos had entered the plot, also to the Royal Canadian Mounties, who were surveilling Michelle Duclos. On the morning that it was known that she had obtained dynamite. This was a time when the French Canadians in the province of Quebec were agitating a great deal for independence and recognition of their French character, and they were putting bombs in post office boxes. And so the conspirators, the 3 core conspirators, had gotten a connection to Michelle Duclos and had persuaded her to bring dynamite to New York to be used to blow up the Statue of Liberty. They had planned to place a charge right on the beam that supports the upraised arm of the Statue of Liberty, and we're going to cause the arm to fall down to the side.
It's like a Warner Brothers cartoon.
It was better. Well, we investigated and investigated and investigated, and we called on every member of her family. We went to see her father. And he was a straight-backed, very, very correct, although French, he had made himself into a Brit. This was exactly. He had a little Montgomery mustache, and he wore an elegant Scottish tweed suit, and he said, "Let me read you the telegram that I sent to my daughter in prison in New York." It said, "My dear daughter, honor, courage, and above all, truth, your loving father." We kind of suspected that maybe her father didn't have the passcode into her heart. We talked also to her younger sister, who was a sweet young thing, but kind of a wounded bird. Anyway, we did what we could. We investigated, and finally 4 days had passed, and it was time to come back to New York. We had done everything we could, at least that's what I thought. We had 2 hours left to pack up our bags, get on the plane, and go home with nothing to show for our adventure. Frank said to me, "We got 2 hours. Let's look for the gas station guy." Look for the gas station guy. The Mounties had been observing her, as I told you, when she embarked to go to New York. And they wrote in their report, which was available to us, that when she tried to start her car to go on this journey, the car wouldn't start. I think in her excitedness, she flooded the engine. The car wouldn't start. And she got out of the car, she opened the hood, and she was looking helplessly under the hood when a passing car stopped. And a man got out who was wearing the green uniform with the green high point cap that in those days was conventionally worn by gas station assistants. And this person chatted with her and helped her start the car, and then left, and she went off on her fateful journey, trailed by the Mounties till she reached the border. There she was picked up by the FBI until she drove all the way at Westchester. When she arrived in Westchester with a car full of dynamite, they arrested her. They stopped the car, arrested her, and brought the whole plot down, arrested everybody. Well, Frank said, let's look for the gas station guy. I said, how are we going to find the gas station guy? And besides, if we find the gas station guy, what's he going to tell us? I mean, you think she said to him, I've got a car full of dynamite and I'm going to blow up the Statue of Liberty? Frank said, you're right. You're probably right, but we got 2 hours. We got nothing else to show for this trip. Let's look for the gas station guy. So I reluctantly acceded, and we packed our bags, got in the car with the Mounties, and they took us from gas station to gas station to gas station in I think it was the Sherbrooke area where she lived. And in each station, the Mounties would introduce us as representatives of the government of the United States. They'd like to ask you a few questions. We had a photograph. Do you by any chance know this woman? Her name is Michelle Duclos. No, 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 no. We struck out once, we struck out 3 times, 5 times, 7 times. Time was getting short. I said, Frank, I think it's time to go catch our plane. Pierre, we still got a few minutes. Let's do one more. I did an eye roll that any teen would have been proud of. But I agreed. Let's do one more. We go to the next gas station. Photograph. Do you know this woman? Her name is Michelle Duclos. A silence for 5 or 6 minutes. My throat closed up with excitement. Then he spoke, the most eloquent words ever spoken. I think we should go across the street and have a cup of coffee. Well, what did we learn having that cup of coffee? The man knew Michelle Duclos for years. He had been repairing her cars. He had been the gas station guy that she went to get her car inspected and so forth. He had a history as a demolitions expert in the Canadian Army in the Korean War. And 2 weeks before that morning, she had gone to him and asked him if he could give her advice as to how to build a bomb. He asked her why. She demurred, but she told him it's something really big, something in a foreign country and really big. We didn't go home empty-handed.
That's good.
So the experience of working with Frank all that time, I've described it as a golden era. It was a golden era for me. It was incredible. Frank and I learned a great deal from our mentor, Steve Kaufman. I also learned a ton from my co-pupil, about all the virtues that he brought to life. Now, Frank was a person who had only one way of presenting himself to the world. He never raised his voice. He never was surly or sulky. He never was in a bad mood. He never spoke without having given careful consideration to what he was going to say. He never was disrespectful of anyone. He was simply an extraordinary person. I've never met the likes of him. It came to be that everyone, as I described to you the progress of knowing Frank Thomas, Everybody wanted him. Everybody wanted his advice. And he quite naturally rose to the very, very pinnacle of the world. He was an amazing person to have known. I'll never see the likes of him again. And what a privilege it is to be here to talk about him.
So if you're interested in a career late in life, a second career, true crime narrator would very well, sir. I don't know. I'm like sweating right now.
Just
grab like dynamite. Ken, talk to us about your first time meeting him and kind of knowing him and working with him.
Yeah, so it's going to be hard to top the judge's story. But let me say that I was in awe of Franklin Thomas before I met him. And the first time I heard about Franklin Thomas was when I was 10 years old. And I had an uncle that had gone to Columbia, and he talked to me about Franklin Thomas for several reasons. One, I was a kid who loved sports. I tested well, but I was an indifferent student. Drove my parents crazy till I got to high school. And I think my Uncle Howard was always presenting me, as my father was, with role models to try to shake me to get focused. And my uncle told me the story of Franklin Thomas at Franklin Lane High School in Columbia. And what was really impressive was, as I'm sure you've heard, he was the leading rebounder. He was captain of the Columbia team, and he was an excellent student. So you clearly understand the message that I was getting. And I used to go into Bedford-Stuyvesant because I also played basketball. And talking to some of the people in the neighborhood about those legends, Frank Thomas was one of those individuals. Later in life, I finished law school in 1976, Harvard Law School, and I had been following Franklin Thomas, his move to the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Center, and in 1979, when he was named president of the Ford Foundation, I was like, wow, this is absolutely incredible. This is someone who was in the corridors of power. And I attended a few of his speeches, but didn't have the nerve to go up to him and say, Franklin Thomas, you're the man. And I first met him in person through Vernon Jordan, who, as you know, was a very close friend. And that relationship was an incredible relationship. The two loved each other. It was the ultimate in a bromance. It was just palpable. And Vernon said to me, you need to spend time with Franklin Thomas. And so I came down to the Ford Foundation, and the trappings were incredible. And we had a lunch for 3.5 hours. And I talked to him about how I learned about him. I talked to him about what he represented to me. But I think what was very important that I saw within 10 minutes of speaking with him is this was a man of character and values. And when I think of Franklin Thomas, I think of the values of integrity. For me, integrity is the consistency of words and actions. I can't think of anyone who had a higher level of integrity than Franklin Thomas. We talked about South Africa and what he was doing to end apartheid. And we talked about the rights of women, and he thought it was very important he said, as a leader, you need to be very focused on gender equality. That there sometimes were divisions in the civil rights community relative to the role of women, and he said, you've got to recognize that. And one of the things that I've just been incredibly impressed with Franklin is that he really understood the power of diversity, the need to embrace all types of people. And he was someone who educated me about the ways of the boardroom. And one of the most interesting times was there was a period when American Express and Citicorp almost came together. And I had been involved on the American Express side. I was not president of the company at that time. I think I was vice chairman. But I was very involved in putting the strategy together of how the two companies could come together. It's a very interesting situation because you had Vernon Jordan on the American Express board, Franklin Thomas on the Citicorp board. And it was potentially, if you think about the time, and this was the early 90s, this would have been the largest retail financial services firm in the world. At that time, it could have been an interesting deal. And I had recommended basically that we should carve out the corporate banking part of Citicorp. And I said, what we need to do is focus on retail fully, which I think was the right move. Never happened. But what was interesting at that time is John Reed asked Frank if he would talk to me. And what was important here is that I was not CEO and I wasn't president, and Frank said to him, well, why do you want me to talk to Ken? I can't go around the leadership. I'm glad to talk to him as a friend, but what I'm not going to do is, in fact, talk to him and bypass the hierarchy, which I think was very important. And what Frank did say to me is, one, you've caught the eye of the people at Citicorp. You obviously are highly thought of from the board. You may be presented with some interesting opportunities. My advice to you is to always act with integrity. Do what's right. There may be some opportunities, and you've got to decide if that's right for you. And without going into a lot of detail, what happened a few days later is I was approached to say, when this deal happens, we're going to move Harvey Golub out, and we're going to put you in. And I said, and I didn't know that, obviously Harvey did not know that. And I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. That's not me. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm now going to have to tell Harvey of what it is. And what was important there is that Frank did not compromise his integrity. He did not tell me what was going to happen. But what he clearly said was, you got to live your values. What do you stand for? And I think as I think about the lessons from Frank is he was a warrior for human rights in every setting that he was in. Wow. He did not allow the setting to define him. He was the first, always, but he wasn't coward by being the first. And one of my fondest memories that I would do once a year is I would take Vernon Jordan and Frank Thomas to a Knick game. and it was like the protocols, you know, I'd have a car pick them up. They were both dressed to the nines. You know, people clearly, when they walked in, it was like, oh my gosh, it's all there. And one of my favorite photos is we were looking at the game, and Frank was sort of leaning over and saying, which he often did, you know, I know these guys can play one-on-one, but I want to see the teamwork. And Vernon was saying, Frank, you think you could play with those guys? So, you know, I think my point is that Frank was a role model to me throughout my life. And as a young black boy growing up, to see someone evolve and to have someone that made me proud. And what I felt really in every interaction with Frank was I learned something, but most importantly, his lessons about character and integrity made a big difference in my life.
I'm like really impressed by how powerful you make it sound about coming to see him for the first time at Ford. Because my first time coming to see Darren, he had slippers in the office to get me to the Ford, to the cafeteria. So, so it's very different. But anyway, Judge. So what was it about? I'm trying to figure out, like, this young man at the time when you first met him. You know, this is not a period in American life where it's easy to be a black man. It's not now, but definitely not then. And he was, you know, a quiet, shy man who is just leaning on his talents and his temperament to take him where he wanted to go in life. How do you believe that he was able to navigate all the things that he accomplished just by leaning into talent, character, temperament? And how did the world bend around that? I mean, I'm very curious about how he does it all.
It's a fantastic question, and if I try to ask myself the question, what would happen if when I was in that situation, if all of a sudden I was asked to become the head of the Ford Foundation and a director of all these corporations without having any foundation to learn those things? What would I would have been an incredible failure, and that's why I was never asked, and he was. But as I spoke about one part of what you're asking about. I spoke before about how did it come about that these extraordinary things were placed on his lap. And it was because he had these impressive qualities, and because, as Ken was saying, he had absolute integrity. He knew what his standards were. He wouldn't bend for I mean, I have no doubt that Frank Thomas, that there were pressures on him to bend thousands of times until maybe people realized that it's just that you just don't get anywhere doing that. But he presented this person. He had this character where he would not speak without having given careful thought to what should be said. He wouldn't flippantly say things off the top of his head that get you into trouble. He just was a person of integrity and reliability, and the world, I mean, I guess when he was I don't know what the piece is. I don't know what the piece is that brought him to Bed-Stuy. He left the U.S. Attorney's Office because the executive assistant of our U.S. Attorney's Office, a man named Vin Broderick, became police commissioner, and Vin took Frank to become the deputy in charge of legal affairs to the police department. Now, somehow or other, Frank came to the attention of the people, Benno Schmidt at Whitney and Company, and other people who chose him to go to Bed-Stuy. Now, Bed-Stuy had a board of powerful people, the chair of Citibank, the chair of CBS, not chairs, CEOs of all those companies, and that, they learned about Frank Thomas, and when the vacancy came at the Ford Foundation, he was the man. He had just impressed everybody with his fantastic. How he was able to do those things so superbly without slipping in the mud and failing. Well, that's why he impressed those people. He had those sublime qualities. He was amazing.
I'm learning so much. I mean, that's where I'm going wrong. I'm not thinking before I talk. I'm just. There it is. So, Ken, we in the Black community pay very close attention to the fact that very often when the Black person becomes the first, it's because the thing is falling apart. Right? Like, so Obama becomes the president because the global economy is literally this close to collapsing.
Right.
Right? Dinkins becomes the mayor of this city when, right after this massive recession, which is the biggest one since World War II. Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to become the first woman on the Supreme Court when the liberals are basically locked in the majority probably for a generation. But they all seem to just perform like Frank and rise and deliver. What is it about Frank in that kind of equation that you think prepared him to be able or enabled him to be able to rise and deliver and bring the Ford Foundation out of its financial problems, needing restructuring, and being able to do all that under a microscope of people not wanting to change?
So I think several things as I look at what I think are what I call enduring leaders. And Franklin Thomas was an enduring leader. There are people that can be a leader for 3 years or 5 years, but to really be a leader that people revere over time is really challenging. So I think first and foremost is we talk about Frank's integrity, which is the highest level. And why is that important? Is if you want to be an enduring leader, you have to build trust. You have to be able to create a level of trust because you're going to take people through challenges that you don't have all the answers. And so trust has to emanate from you. And he really did engender great trust. Second is, Frank was an incredibly self-aware person. I think the best leaders are very self-aware. They understand their strengths, they understand their weaknesses, they understand their impact on people, but there's an inner resolve that they have. I think also Frank was courageous. And I think the best leaders are courageous. I also think that you've got to be caring. People sometimes get that confused with leadership. They think someone who is caring and compassionate is weak. Frank was caring and compassionate. Frank was also incredibly decisive. And this is where people get things confused because they think if you're compassionate, you can't be decisive. Let me tell you, Frank was analytical. He was very pragmatic. He would make the call. But this combination of being both compassionate and decisive, what do enduring leaders do? They win the hearts and minds of people. And that's what Frank did. He won the hearts and minds of people. So when it came to making decisions of conscience, Frank was there. And I think that in the world we live in today, the fact that people don't really know what the truth is, or they don't care what the truth is, that we don't have a strong enough focus on values and character. And the reality is, Frank was someone who had the tenacity to carry out long-term objectives. And at the same time, he had a great sense of urgency. And we all talk about Frank may not have raised his voice a lot, but I will tell you, you could sometimes feel the anger, the frustration. But again, one of the important qualities, in my view, about great leaders is they have composure. You always felt with Frank he was in control, when in fact, there's no way that anyone is 100% ever in control of themselves. But the stoicness and the ability to have that composure, I think, has been a key ingredient to Frank's success.
With that, I think we are done.
Thank you. Judge, thank you very much.
Beautiful talk.
Thank
Really
you.
beautiful.
Thank you. Yours.
Thank you, gentlemen. And finally, a woman who needs no introduction in this building, because as a young graduate of Vassar College a few decades ago, she entered the doors of the Ford Foundation, found herself working for the great McGeorge Bundy, and I remember Frank telling me the story of his last meeting with McGeorge Bundy, the sort of presidential baton handoff. And McGeorge Bundy said to him, "Keep your eye on that young woman, Beresford. She's got talent." And I remember Frank telling me that with a big smile, Susan. And McGeorge Bundy was right. Please join me in welcoming Susan Beresford.
I first met Frank in 1972, and I was a very junior staff person here, helping with a review of Ford-supported work in Bed-Stuy. And then our paths crossed often in the community development field, in feminist organizations, and then when he became a trustee of the Ford Foundation. And then in his 17 years as president, we worked very closely together. And afterwards, my 12 years as president, we talked a lot about what was going on here. And after both of us retired, I would visit him in his office and we talked often. So that's a span of almost 50 years. And along the way, I got to know his beloved Kate and members of their joined family. And so there's a great deal for me to recall. But today, I only have time for a few of the most significant recollections about the ways Frank strengthened this foundation. I think you're going to hear themes that all the prior wonderful speakers have underlined. I think you'll see that the talent and vision and personality that I'm going to describe are the same qualities that Frank brought to every part of his life. And to me, part of the answer of where those came from are in the early chapters of your wonderful book, Celia, because I think his early upbringing underscored a lot of those qualities very, very strongly. But now to the Ford Foundation. First and most importantly, Frank redesigned the investment and spending policies here. The policies he had inherited had led the foundation to the brink of extinction. We were about to go out of business. And he set in motion a dramatic reduction of spending and budgeting that linked to long-term asset growth and stability. Frank had a long-term vision. We've heard that. And I think if he had done nothing else, that first heroic intervention would have been widely celebrated as saving the foundation. I think you mentioned that, Darren, saving the foundation. But it was only the beginning for Frank. Having right-sized Ford, he then coined a phrase for us, One Foundation. And he told us that this would be a slimmer institution, and it would have one unified program agenda wherever we were in the world. 5 cross-cutting program areas would characterize what we did anywhere. He believed that our grantees could learn from each other across borders and that their combined voices would be a global force for change. This was a huge change here. It meant closing down some very favored and long-standing programs with big interest groups behind them, and it meant breaking down very strong geographic silos. A doubling of Ford support for women's rights and opportunities around the world was the first major initiative Frank took in the One Foundation process. And this was controversial in a lot of quarters. We had internal critics here who said that we would be exporting American values and culture if we pushed feminist issues overseas. But of course, Frank knew the truth, that these critics were ignoring what was really happening in their own regions, a struggle for justice and fairness. And after that first initial women's program rights and opportunities effort, other cross-cutting programs followed. This signaled to us that Frank wanted to bring fresh perspectives to all of our work here. And so we understood when he ended something that had been an informal staff tenure system that had allowed people to stay in jobs long periods of time. Frank believed that had contributed to program ossification in certain places. He believed that a new person taking over a grant portfolio every 5 or 6 years would allow new air to come in, new relationships to develop, new thoughts to be brought to bear. So that was a big change here. Frank had been a community-level grantee, and he also knew that the foundation had not listened carefully enough, sometimes, to people living with the problems that we were working on. He said that strategies for social change often ignored the ideas and talents that abound even in the most blighted neighborhoods. Of course, he was right. Research, policy analysis, and all that is very, very important in all strategies, but so is the voice of people who live with a problem day by day. They have ideas, they have concerns. So Frank increased our focus on the community level he knew so well, and he put increased financial resources in the hands of leaders of local institutions. He also observed that Ford had not effectively engaged with the business community and all the huge resources and know-how in that field, in that sector. So again, he added that to our work. And that led to yet another change, that we needed to find structures and people who could work in partnership across sectors. And the Local Initiative Support Corporation that Frank was very much in support of, very much part of the creation of, which was a quintessential example of this, a cross-sectoral community development effort, but there were many more. We all admired Frank's deep engagement with South Africa and its search for social justice. We celebrated when the foundation opened an office in Johannesburg. It was thrilling for us. And Frank and Kate's long-standing relationship with Nelson Mandela inspired us. We followed every step of it. Reopening a Ford Foundation office in Hanoi in Vietnam and helping to rebuild that war-torn nation was another very courageous decision Frank took. It meant dealing with the past harm of the country and some of our former staff. This wasn't an easy process. Many of them had disappeared. But it signaled again Frank's integrity and Frank's optimism that we could make a difference. Last, I want to mention his love and care for this building and the city it sits in. Frank inherited this building when it was in somewhat of a worn condition. And he refreshed and renewed it, and he reimagined the top floor, part of which is now properly called the Frank Thomas Room. It's wonderful to see that. So I think this foundation, this wonderful institution, owes its survival and healthy evolution to Franklin Thomas. He shifted Ford's style and approach, and he was way ahead of his time also. When you look back now on the things he did, they're quite commonly done. And people think, oh, of course that's the right thing to do. That was not the case when he did them. And that brings me to the last set of comments I want to make about how he managed people. I think everybody here knows it's not easy to dramatically change an institution. It certainly wasn't easy here. Frank's ideas were welcomed by a lot of us, but they were resisted by some, particularly some of the old guard here. And I remember with pain cringeworthy exchanges when the resistors patronized and stonewalled Frank. And my favorite such memory occurred once after he had asked a division leader 3 different times over a year to reduce his budget by 30% and come in with a plan to move the program into these new 5 program areas. And he asked him a 4th time, and Frank heard yet another patronizing refusal. Frank, you don't understand what you're talking about, he was told. And in a calm and firm voice, Frank said, and I remember every word of this, I will ask you only one more time, and I remind you that I am president, not you. And we can do this without you. Very calm, very clear. So Frank was patient and gave the staff a long time to adjust to the changes we all knew were the right thing, but there was also a limit. He was a decisive person in that sense. Frank was also extraordinarily observant and kind to the staff around him. He chaired a weekly meeting where grants above a certain dollar level came. We called it the officers' meeting. And people came and presented their grants, and they were discussed and ultimately mostly approved. The meetings helped us be one foundation. It helped us understand what was going on in the different parts of the foundation. And we also got to learn from Frank every single week. But very often after the meeting, he would take Buzz Tenney or me aside and he'd say, you know, I noticed so-and-so over there looked troubled or looked tired or looked confused. What do you think is going on? Is there something we should try and do? He was very observant and sensitive to those around him, and that included me. Every time I was down, Frank was always there to cheer me up and help me work through something. So while Frank brought about dramatic change and progress here, we all know he was modest and reserved. He was a determined optimist who took a long-term view of change. He knew that teamwork, persistence, and a willingness to withstand prejudice and resistance were all part of the change process. Place, people, and ideas mattered to him. He believed that every human being had ability and the possibility of making this world a better place. We all miss his vision, his captivating style, and his dignity. And I think we're all lucky to have worked with him. This gathering of some of his admirers and colleagues from all the different sectors he worked in testified to the breadth of the worlds that he improved. And it's really lovely to have his book, his memoir, to remind us all of his lovely legacy and his wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for those beautiful reflections. So in closing, I thought I would first, again, thank dear Kate, and I also want to thank you for the honor of your invitation to write the foreword to Frank's book. And I want to leave you with a few sentences from that. So what are we to make of a world without Frank? Now that he has left us, how are we to inhabit this world that he shaped and improved for us, knowing we feel his absence and miss his voice? Let us resolve then to continue as Frank did, to know love and to be generous, to be righteous in our cause, but never self-righteous in our character, to advance the slow and steady march of progress, to bend the arc of the moral universe with our own hands, in our own ways, towards justice. Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for being here. We have lunch for those of you who would like to stay for lunch in the Susan Beresford room and the Franklin Thomas Boardroom on the 11th floor. We ask your patience as you navigate the elevators, but they're all working and will zip you right up to the 11th floor. Thank you all.